All right. So, you know how we love to look at the big picture?
Yeah.
The really significant stuff happening around the world, right?
Absolutely.
Well, this week, the material you sent over, it really takes us to the core of a huge geopolitical shift that's going on right now in Asia.
Yeah.
And that is the rise of something called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or a lot of people just call it the Quad.
Yeah, the Quad.
Yeah, and this is a strategic partnership, let's call it, between India, the United States, Japan, and Australia.
That's right.
So really, our mission in this deep dive, I guess, is to figure out, what does this actually mean for Asia, and why are so many analysts and experts calling it a counter to China's, increasing influence?
Yeah, for sure. And it's important to understand that this isn't something that just popped up overnight. To really get a grip on what the Quad means, you got to go back and look at its beginnings.
Okay.
So the initial idea actually came about back in 2007, and it was Japan's prime minister at the time, Shinzo Abe, who envisioned it.
Yeah.
He really wanted to see this kind of partnership of democracies across the Indo-Pacific region, and they'd all be united by this commitment to a free, open, rules-based kind of international order.
So, okay, interesting. So they were kind of being proactive and thinking about, well, this is the kind of vision we want to see for the region.
Exactly.
But it wasn't an immediate success, was it?
No, it kind of stalled out for a variety of reasons. Maybe there wasn't a shared sense of urgency at that point, I guess. But things change, right? The world is a dynamic place, and the geopolitical landscape shifted, and we see this major resurgence of the Quad after 2017.
Okay.
And this renewed energy, it's largely driven by growing concerns about China, and specifically China being more assertive, particularly in the South China Sea.
Okay.
Their Belt and Road Initiative, which is just a massive infrastructure project across the globe, really, and just in general, a ramp up of their military activities.
Okay. So we're seeing this renewed focus on the Quad, and it's clear that each of these four nations, right, India, the U.S., Japan, Australia, they all had their own specific reasons,
their own interests.
Yeah, for coming together and really committing to this time around.
Yeah.
So let's break that down a little bit. Let's look at those individual reasons, and I guess we could start with India.
Yeah.
What were some of their primary concerns?
Well, India's got a big neighbor, right? And they share a border. The line of actual control. A lot of people call it the LAC.
The LAC, yes.
And there's been tensions along that border. Yeah. There's been these border disputes that have been going on for years.
Right.
So China's military presence, right there on their border is a big factor in how India thinks strategically. Yeah,
makes sense.
And then on top of that, India is also paying very close attention to China's growing presence down in the Indian Ocean. And that they see that as something that could really impact their own, sphere of influence, as they call it.
Right. So a powerful neighbor making moves really on two fronts,
Yeah.
A land border and a maritime border.
Yeah, exactly.
And those are some pretty clear motivators for India.
For sure.
Okay, well, let's shift over to the United States then. They've been a major player in the Indo-Pacific for decades.
Yeah, the dominant power.
Yeah, for sure. So what was it that really got them to engage, even more deeply with this Quad idea?
Well, I mean, the U.S. has always seen itself as, kind of the leader in that part of the world in the Indo-Pacific. Yeah. And so I think their motivation with the Quad is really all about trying to hold on to that influence as China rises. It's not just about containing China militarily, it's about kind of reasserting, their vision for the region, which is, promoting democratic values, a rules-based order, things that China doesn't necessarily, prioritize in the same way.
Right.
So it's about, making sure there's a balance of power and shaping, what the order in the region is going to look like.
Right. So a lot of different factors there for the U.S.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on to Japan. Then, they're an island nation, and they face some pretty direct security challenges. So what are the big things driving them to be such an active participant in the Quad? Yeah,
I mean, when you look at a map, you can see how close Japan and China are, right? And so Japan's really dealing with these security threats from China right there in the East China Sea. And in particular over these islands that Japan administers, but that China also claims.
Okay.
And so Japan's really worried about, making sure that ships can travel freely through these waters because they're a major trading nation. So freedom of navigation is a big one for them. And the Quad, really fits with Japan's long-standing commitment to stability in the region.
Okay.
And upholding, international maritime law.
Right. So those are some pretty clear interests for them.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, we've got one more to go. Let's talk about Australia.
Okay.
Geographically, they're in a really significant spot. And they also have some unique, economic factors to consider. So what is it that's brought them more firmly into this Quad framework?
Yeah, so Australia, it's interesting because on one hand, they've got this really strong economic relationship with China,
right.
But at the same time, there's this growing sense of concern. They're kind of worried about becoming too dependent on China,
right?
And that China might use that economic power to influence them politically. So it's a tricky situation for them, but at the same time, they're also really aware of these bigger security challenges that are developing across the region. And so they see the Quad as this way to address those collectively, to try to create a more stable and secure environment, for everyone.
Okay, so a bit of a tightrope walk for them.
Yeah.
Trying to balance the economic reality.
For sure, a delicate balance.
With these evolving, security concerns.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these 4 countries.
Yeah.
Right, and they've all got their own reasons for coming together.
Yeah.
To try to deal with this growing influence of China in the region.
Oh, yeah.
But it's one thing to say, okay, we're gonna get together. We're going to talk, this is a good idea.
Right.
It's another thing to say, okay, but what are we actually going to do?
Yeah, what's the action plan?
Yeah, what's the game plan?
Right.
What are the objectives of this, of this power huddle?
Right. Well, security is a big part of it, but it's not the whole picture.
Okay.
The Quad's ambitions really go beyond just, military cooperation.
Yeah.
I mean, one of their core objectives is this idea of promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Okay, so let's break that down a little. What does that actually mean in real world terms?
Okay, so at its core, it's about these principles like freedom of navigation.
Okay.
So that means ships and planes should be able to travel freely.
Okay.
It's about upholding the rule of law. It's about, settling disputes peacefully.
Yeah.
And it's about respecting the sovereignty of every country in the region.
Right.
And so this directly challenges some of the things that China's been doing in the South China Sea, where they've been building up their military presence and making these really expansive claims to territory.
Right. So it's about setting up and upholding, these norms for the region, these rules of the road.
Exactly.
Okay, so what else is on their to-do list? We hear a lot about infrastructure development.
Yeah, that's another big one.
Yeah.
The Quad is really trying to offer an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And they do that by supporting infrastructure projects in developing countries.
Okay.
But it's not just about, building roads and bridges.
Yeah.
It's about, offering these countries a different model for development.
Right.
And it's about giving them more choices.
Right. So instead of just having one option, these countries have, okay, well, maybe we'll go with this model. Maybe we'll go with that model.
Exactly. It's about options.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned defense cooperation before. How does that actually work in practice? Are they setting up, a mini NATO?
No, nothing like that. I mean, the most visible part of this defense collaboration is the joint military exercises that they do.
Okay.
And the most well-known one is called the Malabar Naval Exercises.
Okay.
And that involves, the navies of all 4 Quad countries.
Okay.
And the goal there is, to improve how they work together, to build trust, and to show that they can operate together as a unit.
Right. So it's not, they're not signing a treaty and saying, we're going to defend each other, if somebody gets attacked.
Right.
But they are, flexing their muscles a little bit, showing the world, hey, look, we can
work together.
We can work together.
Yeah.
Okay, well, shifting gears a little bit, we're in the 21st century, so we got to talk about, technology and cybersecurity.
Absolutely. I mean, these days, emerging technologies and cybersecurity, those are huge. Yeah. And the Quad is really focusing on those areas, things like 5G networks.
Okay.
Artificial intelligence, how to counter cyber attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're sharing information, they're trying to set up common standards, and they're working together to build up really resilient digital infrastructure across the whole region.
Right. So it's not just about, ships and planes and tanks anymore.
Exactly.
The internet.
The digital realm.
Yeah, the digital realm is this whole other,
Yeah, battle space. Exactly. So it seems like they're also trying to broaden their scope a little bit. We're seeing them talk about things like pandemic response and climate change.
That's right.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, they've definitely expanded their agenda to include these things.
Okay.
Like distributing vaccines in Asia and trying to promote renewable energy solutions.
Right.
And I think the idea is to show that the Quad is really committed to the overall well-being and development of the region.
Right. So it's not just this, narrow focus on security. It's about, okay, we're partners in a more, holistic way.
Yeah, a more comprehensive approach.
Yeah. Okay. So the Quad's got this pretty wide-ranging, set of goals, and it's pretty clear that it goes beyond just, the military side of things.
Yeah.
But how does China feel about all of this? They've kind of famously called it an Asian NATO. Yeah, that's a term they like to use. Although, the Quad members themselves, they try to avoid that label.
Right.
From China's point of view, they basically see the Quad as this geopolitical play.
Okay.
As an attempt to contain them, to prevent them from, becoming more powerful in Asia.
Right.
And so they see it as a strategy to encircle them.
Okay.
And to limit, their ability to project power.
Okay. So a lot of suspicion there,
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So specifically when you think about, the military side of things.
Yeah.
How does China view all of these joint exercises that the Quad is doing?
Yeah, I mean, they're not thrilled about it.
Yeah.
The military exercises, the fact that the U.S. is more active with its allies in the region. They see all of that as a direct challenge to their position in the region and to their own security. So they look at these activities with a lot of distrust.
Yeah.
They're kind of thinking, well, are they getting ready for a conflict? Is this all part of this containment strategy?
Okay, so it's creating a lot of tension for sure.
Yeah.
And what about the whole infrastructure development piece?
Yeah.
How does that fit into China's view, especially when you consider their Belt and Road, project?
Right. Well, they see the Quad's efforts as a direct competitor to Belt and Road. They see it as an attempt to take away some of their economic influence.
Yeah.
And to establish a different kind of influence in the region.
Right. So you've got these two competing visions.
Exactly.
For how to develop, these different countries and
for influence.
Yeah. Okay. So China clearly sees the Quad as, this multifaceted challenge to what they want to achieve.
Yeah. A major obstacle.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, so how are they responding to this, on a diplomatic level? What are they doing to counter, this growing, group?
Well, they've really stepped up their diplomatic game.
Okay.
I mean, they're working hard to strengthen their ties with other countries in Asia and around the world. They're doing more trade deals.
Oh.
They're increasing military cooperation with certain partners, and they're really trying to use, what people call soft power. To build relationships,
Right.
and to kind of portray the Quad as this divisive force,
Okay, so they're trying to paint the Quad in a negative light.
Exactly, they're pushing back.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got this this really interesting picture emerging. These competing visions for influence in a really important part of the world.
Yeah, it's a high stakes game.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's zoom out a little bit.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the Quad members themselves and China, but how is this impacting, the wider Asian region, beyond just those five players?
Well, it's definitely having a ripple effect, and one of the big things is the impact on the balance of power.
Okay.
I mean, the Quad is undeniably a counter to China's growing military strength.
Yeah.
And that can be really reassuring to some of the smaller countries in the region.
Okay.
Countries that might feel threatened by China,
Right.
Like Vietnam or the Philippines. They've got their own territorial disputes with China.
Right.
So they might see the Quad as, a potential source of support.
Right. So it gives them a little bit of, breathing room, a little bit of strategic depth.
Exactly. A sense of security.
Yeah. Okay. So we see that impact on these smaller countries. what about the relationships, between the Quad members themselves and with other countries in the region,
Yeah, well, the Quad has definitely brought the four members closer together. There's more trust, there's more cooperation across the board. And it's also opened up opportunities for, partnerships with other countries in Asia.
Okay.
Countries that share similar concerns about, stability in the region.
Right. Okay. So that's a positive.
Yeah.
You're creating these webs of relationships, but are there good potential downsides to this?
Yeah, for sure.
Could it backfire in some way?
It could. I mean, one worry is that it could lead to more polarization in the region.
Okay. What does that mean?
Well, you could end up with smaller countries feeling like they have to choose sides.
Okay.
Are they with the Quad? Are they with China?
Right.
And that could make things really complicated for them,
Yes.
in terms of their foreign policy.
Right. So these countries are being forced to, really think carefully about, okay, who are our friends?
Exactly.
Who are our enemies?
Right.
Okay. So that's definitely a potential, risk there.
Definitely.
What about the economic side of things? We talked about the infrastructure competition, but are there other economic impacts that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, having these alternative infrastructure options, from the Quad, it really gives developing countries more economic freedom.
Oh.
It means they don't have to rely on China as much.
Okay.
And that gives them, more flexibility in how they develop their economies.
Right. So it's potentially a way to, reduce their dependence on China.
Exactly.
Okay. That makes sense. One last group I want to talk about is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Yeah.
They're a big player in the region. What's their take on the Quad's growing influence, right there in their backyard?
Yeah, ASEAN has been pretty cautious about the Quad. I mean, they definitely share some of the concerns about, regional stability and the importance of the rule of law. But they're also worried that, the Quad might become too powerful.
Okay.
And that could overshadow ASEAN.
Right. So it's kind of a potential challenge to their own influence in the region.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So it sounds like the Quad is really, shaking things up in Asia.
Yeah.
It's impacting the relationships between a whole bunch of different players.
Yeah, for sure.
But, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a magic bullet.
No, definitely not.
So what are some of the criticisms?
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges that the Quad's facing?
Well, one big one is that, you've got these four countries and they all have their own interests, right?
Right.
And those interests don't always align perfectly.
Yeah.
They might agree on the big picture.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the details of how to deal with China,
yeah,
there can be differences and that can slow things down.
Okay, so that makes sense. Four sovereign nations, they're going to have their own agendas.
For sure.
Okay, well, what about the structure of the Quad itself?
Yeah.
It's not like NATO, it's
Right.
not a formal military alliance.
Yeah, it's much looser.
Yeah. So is that a problem?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gives them a lot of flexibility. They can move quickly, they can adapt,
Oh.
But on the other hand, it also means that it's harder to coordinate things.
Okay.
And, the commitments might not be as strong.
Right, because they're not bound by a treaty.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And of course, we touched on this before, but, this economic interdependence that some of the Quad members have with China,
Yeah.
that's got to be a tough one to manage.
Absolutely, especially for Australia and Japan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Their economies are really tied to China, so they have to be really careful.
Yeah.
They have to balance their security concerns with their economic interests.
It's a real balancing act.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Okay. And then lastly, there's this question of perception.
Yeah.
How is the Quad seen by other countries?
Right.
Beyond the members themselves and China?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a risk that some countries will see the Quad as, this Western-led effort to contain China. And that could make those countries hesitant to engage with the Quad,
Okay.
So I think one of the big challenges for the Quad is to show the world that, they're not just about containing China.
Right.
They're about, promoting stability and prosperity for the whole region.
Right. So really trying to emphasize, the positive aspects of this partnership.
Exactly.
Okay. So I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Right.
It's pretty clear that the Quad is a really significant development in Asia and globally.
Yeah, a game changer for sure.
Yeah, and it shows us that these four countries are realizing that they need to work together. To deal with this really complicated and constantly changing environment.
For sure, and it's not just about reacting to China.
Yeah,
it's about shaping the future of the region.
Okay, so I guess the big question, and this is maybe something for you listening out there to ponder.
Yeah.
Can the Quad keep up this momentum?
Yeah.
Can they be an effective counterweight to China without, making things even more tense in the region?
Right.
And what do you think will be the deciding factors?
Yeah.
The things that determine whether they succeed or fail in the long run?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, it really feels like we're watching, a pivotal moment unfold.
Absolutely. A lot's at stake.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there for now.
Yeah, I think so.
But this has been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And, we'll keep an eye on this one.
Yeah, for sure. Keep me posted.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Until next time.
Take care. Thanks.
Bye.